In the sweltering heat of a Georgia summer in 1855, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly under an unforgiving sun, lived a woman whose name would eventually be whispered in both fear and reverence across the entire South. Clara Washington appeared to be everything the plantation masters wanted in their human property: quiet, obedient, hard-working, and seemingly broken by years of bondage. But appearances, as the masters of Whitmore Plantation would soon discover, could be devastatingly deceiving. This is the story of how a mother's love became a weapon that would shake the very foundations of the slavery system, and how one woman's quest for justice would ignite a revolution that the white masters never saw coming. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories that will leave you speechless. Clara Washington had not always been a slave. Born free in the mountains of North Carolina to parents who had purchased their own freedom, she had spent the first 12 years of her life believing that liberty was her birthright. Her father, Moses, was a skilled carpenter who had saved every penny for 7 years to buy his family's freedom. Her mother, Ruth, could read and write, a dangerous skill that she secretly passed on to her daughter. "Knowledge is the one thing they can never take from you, child," Ruth would whisper during their clandestine reading lessons by candlelight. "No matter what happens, no matter where life takes you, what's in your head belongs to you alone." Those words would prove prophetic in ways Ruth could never have imagined. The Washington family's freedom ended abruptly when Clara was 12. A white man named Jeremiah Blackwood claimed that Moses had never properly paid for his freedom, producing forged documents that proved the family still belonged to his deceased father's estate. In the corrupt legal system of the antebellum South, a black family's word meant nothing against a white man's claim, regardless of how fraudulent. Clara watched helplessly as her father was beaten unconscious for protesting the seizure. Her mother was sold immediately to a plantation in Virginia. Clara never saw her again. Clara herself was purchased by Edmund Whitmore, a mid-level plantation owner in Georgia who specialized in breaking young slaves and training them for domestic work. The 16 years that followed were a masterclass in psychological manipulation and systematic dehumanization. Whitmore's method was simple but effective: break the spirit completely, then rebuild it in the shape he desired. Clara's first year at Whitmore Plantation was a nightmare of constant punishment, deliberate humiliation, and calculated cruelty. She was beaten for speaking without permission, whipped for looking white people in the eye, and starved for showing any sign of the intelligence her mother had nurtured. "You ain't nothing but property now, girl," Overseer Jake Morrison told her after a particularly brutal beating. "The sooner you accept that, the easier your life will be." But Clara never truly accepted it. Instead, she learned to hide. She buried her intelligence beneath a mask of simpleton compliance. She concealed her literacy behind carefully practiced ignorance. She transformed her defiance into a performance of perfect submission. By the time she was 20, Clara had become exactly what Whitmore thought he wanted: a house slave who anticipated his needs, never questioned orders, and seemed incapable of independent thought. She cleaned his study without appearing to notice the important documents on his desk. She served meals to his guests without seeming to hear their conversations about slave prices and plantation management. She became invisible in plain sight. Clara's carefully constructed emotional walls began to crumble when she met David. He was a field hand on a neighboring plantation, a man whose spirit had somehow survived intact despite years of bondage. They met during a rare gathering when several plantation owners combined their enslaved populations for a large harvest. David was everything Clara had learned not to be: proud, defiant, unbroken. He spoke to her as if she were a human being rather than property. He looked into her eyes and saw the intelligence she had spent years hiding. "You're not what you pretend to be," he told her during their second meeting. "I don't know what you mean," Clara replied automatically, the response she had been trained to give. "Yes, you do. I can see it. There's a fire in you that you've banked but never extinguished." Their courtship was conducted in stolen moments and whispered conversations. They met during the brief periods when their master's business brought them to the same locations. They communicated through a network of other enslaved people who understood that love was one of the few forms of resistance available to them. When Clara became pregnant with Samuel, She and David knew their time was limited. Enslaved people had no legal right to marriage, no protection for their families, no guarantee that they would be allowed to stay together. "Whatever happens," David told her the night before Samuel was born, "remember that this child is ours, not theirs, ours. And love is the one thing they can never own." Samuel was born in the slave quarters of Whitmore Plantation on a cold February morning in 1847. Clara held her son for the first time and felt something she had thought was dead inside her come roaring back to life. Hope. For the first time in years, she had something worth fighting for. Samuel was followed 2 years later by Mary, a daughter whose birth was complicated by Clara's poor nutrition and the physical demands of her work. Clara nearly died in childbirth, but she fought to survive with a ferocity that surprised even the plantation's doctor. "That woman has an unusual will to live," Dr. Patterson told Whitmore after Clara's recovery. "Good," Whitmore replied. "Strong breeding stock is valuable." Clara raised her children in the impossible space between love and terror. She taught them to be smart, but not too smart, strong but not too strong, proud but never defiant. She shared her mother's lessons about reading and writing in whispered sessions after the plantation had gone to sleep. "Why do we have to hide this, Mama?" Samuel asked one night as Clara taught him to write his name. "Because knowledge is power, baby, and they don't want us to have power. But someday when you're free, you'll need to know these things." "When I'm free?" "You mean if I'm free?" Clara looked into her son's 8-year-old eyes and made a promise that would define the rest of her life. "Not if, Samuel, when. Mama's going to make sure of that." By 1855, cracks were beginning to show in the seemingly stable world of Whitmore Plantation. The cotton market was becoming increasingly volatile, and Whitmore had made several poor investments. He had borrowed heavily against future crops, gambling that prices would remain high. He lost that gamble. Clara, invisible in her role as house slave, overheard the increasingly desperate conversations between Whitmore and his creditors. She listened as he discussed selling land, equipment, and eventually people. "The children are worth good money," she heard him tell his wife one evening. "Young, healthy, good bloodlines. The Hartwell brothers in Charleston are always looking for prime specimens." Clara's blood turned to ice. She knew about the Hartwell brothers. Everyone in the slave community knew about them. They were traders who specialized in separating families, who took particular pleasure in breaking the bonds between parents and children. That night, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She would not wait passively for disaster to strike. She would not hope that Whitmore's financial situation would improve. She would not trust in the mercy of people who had never shown her any. She would take action. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was up against. Clara's years of invisible servitude had given her access to information that most enslaved people never saw. She knew which plantation owners were struggling financially, which overseers were corrupt, which families had secrets they would kill to protect. Now, she began to systematically gather and organize that information. She learned that Whitmore owed money to at least 6 different creditors. She discovered that Morrison, the overseer, had been skimming profits from cotton sales for years. She found out about affairs, illegal business dealings, and family scandals that could destroy reputations across the county. But most importantly, she learned about the Underground Railroad. The network of people helping enslaved individuals escape to freedom was more extensive than she had imagined. There were safe houses within 50 miles of the plantation, conductors who regularly moved through the area, and even some white allies who risked their own safety to help. The key was making contact without exposing herself or others to danger. Clara's opportunity came through an unexpected source, Dr. Patterson, the plantation's physician. During one of his visits to treat a sick slave, Clara overheard him having a heated argument with Whitmore about the treatment of enslaved people. "These people are human beings, Edmund," Patterson said. "The conditions you keep them in are barbaric. They're property, Doctor. I'll treat them however I see fit. Property that you're destroying through neglect and cruelty. It's not just morally wrong, it's economically stupid." Clara filed that conversation away. A white doctor who saw enslaved people as human beings might be someone she could approach. Her chance came 2 weeks later when Mary developed a fever. Clara requested that Dr. Patterson examine her daughter, and during his visit she took a calculated risk. "Doctor," she said quietly while he was packing his medical bag, "if someone wanted to help people who were suffering, how would they go about it?" Patterson looked at her sharply. "That's a dangerous question, Clara." "Yes, sir, but sometimes dangerous questions need to be asked." Patterson studied her face for a long moment. "Hypothetically speaking, such a person might want to contact the Methodist Church in Millerville. The pastor there, Reverend Thompson, is known for his charitable work." It was the opening Clara had been hoping for. Making contact with Reverend Thompson required careful planning and considerable risk. Clara couldn't simply walk off the plantation. Enslaved people needed passes to travel, and any unauthorized absence would result in severe punishment. Her solution came through her work in the big house. Whitmore's wife, Margaret, was a devoutly religious woman who regularly sent Clara to town to purchase supplies for the household. These trips provided the perfect cover for Clara's real mission. The Methodist Church in Millerville was a modest wooden structure that served both white and black congregants, though in strictly segregated sections. Reverend Thompson was a thin, intense man in his 40s whose sermons about Christian charity had earned him suspicion from some of the more conservative plantation owners. Clara approached him after a Sunday service, using the cover of purchasing candles for the Whitmore household. "Reverend Thompson," she said quietly, "Dr. Patterson suggested you might be able to help with a charitable matter." Thompson's expression didn't change, but Clara caught the slight tightening around his eyes. What kind of charitable matter? The kind that helps people find their way to a better place. It was a coded phrase that Dr. Patterson had taught her, and Thompson's reaction confirmed that he understood its meaning. "Such charity requires careful consideration," Thompson replied. "Perhaps you could return next week to discuss the details of your donation." The following week, Clara learned that she had stumbled into something far larger than she had imagined. The Underground Railroad in their area was a sophisticated operation involving dozens of people across multiple states. Reverend Thompson introduced her to the local network. Sarah Mitchell, a free black woman who ran a boarding house that served as a safe house. James Crawford, a white farmer whose property bordered 3 different escape routes. And most surprisingly, Margaret Whitmore's own sister, Elizabeth, who lived in town and had been secretly funding escape operations for years. "Your master's sister-in-law has been one of our most generous supporters," Thompson explained during Clara's second meeting. "She's never forgiven her family for their involvement in slavery." Clara was stunned. Elizabeth Whitmore had been in her master's house dozens of times, had eaten meals that Clara prepared, had been served by Clara without either woman knowing of the other's true sympathies. "The irony is not lost on us," Elizabeth said when she and Clara finally met face to face. "I've been trying to undermine my brother-in-law's operation for years, but I never had someone on the inside who could provide the kind of information we really need." "What kind of information?" "Shipping schedules, financial records, correspondence with other plantation owners. We need to know when slave sales are planned, which routes are being patrolled, which plantations are vulnerable." Clara realized that her position in the Whitmore household made her incredibly valuable to the network. She had access to information that could save lives and disrupt the entire slavery system in their region. "I can get you that information," she said, "but I need something in return." "What?" "Help finding my children when the time comes." Over the following months, Clara became the network's most valuable intelligence asset. Her access to Whitmore's study, combined with her ability to read and write, allowed her to copy important documents and pass along crucial information. She learned that a major slave auction was planned for Charleston in the fall, involving children from at least 12 different plantations. She discovered that several plantation owners were coordinating to increase patrols along known escape routes. She found out about planned sales weeks in advance, giving families time to escape before they could be separated. But Clara's most important discovery involved the Hartwell brothers' operation. Through correspondence she found in Whitmore's desk, she learned that the slave trading company was planning to expand their business significantly. They were actively recruiting plantation owners to sell them children, offering premium prices for young, healthy specimens. The letters made Clara physically ill, but they also provided crucial intelligence. She now knew the names of every plantation owner who was planning to sell children, the dates of planned transactions, and most importantly, the locations where these children were being held before sale. "This is incredible," Reverend Thompson said when Clara shared the information. "With this intelligence, we can intercept some of these sales before they happen. Can you help me find Samuel and Mary? We're working on it. The Hartwell brothers keep detailed records, but accessing them will require someone to infiltrate their Charleston operation." Clara's heart sank. Charleston was hundreds of miles away, and infiltrating a slave trading operation would be incredibly dangerous. "There might be another way," Elizabeth Whitmore suggested. "My husband has business connections in Charleston. I might be able to get information about recent sales through legitimate channels." It was a slim hope, but it was more than Clara had before joining the network. Clara's first direct involvement in a rescue operation came when she learned that Morrison planned to sell a young woman named Rebecca to pay off gambling debts. Rebecca was only 16, and Clara knew that her sale would likely result in sexual exploitation. The plan was complex and dangerous. Clara would create a distraction at the plantation while other network members helped Rebecca escape. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and Morrison would have time to organize a search. Too late, and Rebecca would already be gone. Clara's distraction involved sabotaging the plantation's cotton gin during the height of harvest season. She waited until Morrison was drunk, a frequent occurrence, then loosened several crucial bolts on the machinery. When the gin broke down the next morning, Morrison was too hungover and panicked to organize an effective search for Rebecca. By the time he realized she was missing, Rebecca was already 20 miles away, hidden in Sarah Mitchell's boarding house. The success of the operation was intoxicating. For the first time since her children had been taken, Clara felt like she was fighting back effectively. But success also brought increased scrutiny. "Something's not right," Morrison told Whitmore after Rebecca's disappearance. "People don't just vanish. Someone's helping them." "Do you have any suspects?" "Not yet, but I'm watching everyone more closely now." Clara realized that her activities had put not just herself, but the entire enslaved community at risk. Any increase in surveillance made future operations more dangerous. She needed to be smarter, more careful, and more strategic. Clara's next phase of operations focused on psychological manipulation rather than direct action. She had spent years studying the fears and weaknesses of the white community, and now she began to exploit them systematically. Whitmore's greatest fear was losing control. He had built his entire identity around being the master, the one in charge, the one who commanded absolute obedience. Clara began to chip away at that identity through subtle acts of defiance and manipulation. It started with small things. Whitmore's morning coffee would be slightly cold, his newspapers would be delivered to the wrong room, his favorite chair would be moved just enough to be noticeable. Each incident was minor, but together they created a pattern of disruption that left Whitmore feeling unsettled and paranoid. "The servants are acting strange," he complained to his wife. "Strange how?" "I can't put my finger on it. They're still doing their work, but there's something different about them, something in their eyes." Margaret had noticed it too. The enslaved workers still bowed their heads when spoken to, still said yes sir and no ma'am at the appropriate times. But there was a subtle confidence in their bearing that hadn't existed before. Clara's psychological campaign intensified when she began revealing secrets. She knew about Whitmore's embezzlement, Morrison's corruption, and various scandals involving other plantation owners. She began to let these secrets slip through carefully orchestrated conversations with other enslaved people, knowing that gossip would eventually reach the white community. The effect was devastating. Whitmore found himself facing accusations from business partners. Morrison's wife discovered his financial improprieties. Other plantation owners began questioning deals and relationships they had previously taken for granted. The white community, which had always presented a united front in maintaining control over their enslaved population, began to fracture under the weight of mutual suspicion and distrust. As Clara's reputation spread through the Underground Railroad network, she was contacted by operatives from other regions. Her intelligence gathering had proven so valuable that she was asked to help coordinate operations across multiple states. "We've never had someone with your access and abilities," a conductor named William told her during a secret meeting. "You're seeing patterns and connections that we've missed." Clara had indeed identified several important patterns. She realized that slave sales often followed predictable cycles based on agricultural seasons and economic pressures. She discovered that certain routes were consistently safer than others because of the political sympathies of local law enforcement. Most importantly, she identified which plantation owners were most vulnerable to pressure and which were most likely to retaliate violently against resistance. "We need to think bigger," Clara told the assembled network leaders. "Instead of just reacting to individual crises, we need to start preventing them." "What do you have in mind? Economic warfare. These people only understand money. If we can make slavery unprofitable, we can force them to change their behavior." Clara's plan involved coordinating work slowdowns, equipment sabotage, and strategic escapes across multiple plantations simultaneously. The goal was to create enough economic pressure to force plantation owners to reconsider their reliance on enslaved labor. "It's ambitious," Reverend Thompson admitted, "but it might work." "It will work," Clara said with quiet confidence, "because we have something they don't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." The moment that transformed Clara's personal vendetta into a full-scale revolution came on a humid August morning when she discovered a letter that made her blood run cold. Hidden among Whitmore's correspondence was a detailed report from the Hartwell brothers about recent sales and future plans. The letter contained clinical descriptions of her children's current situations. Samuel, now 9 years old, had been sold to a rice plantation in the South Carolina Low Country, where the mortality rate for enslaved workers was notoriously high. The letter mentioned that he had been difficult to manage and had received corrective discipline multiple times. Mary, barely 7, had been purchased by a wealthy family in Savannah, but the letter contained disturbing references to her unusual intelligence and suggestions that special measures might be necessary to properly train her. Clara's hands shook as she read the clinical descriptions of her children's suffering. But it was the final section of the letter that ignited something explosive within her. "We have identified several additional opportunities for profitable acquisitions in the Georgia region. The recent economic pressures on local plantation owners have created a favorable market for premium specimens. We anticipate acquiring 15-20 children over the next quarter, with particular interest in those aged 6-12 who show signs of intelligence and physical development." The letter included a list of target plantations and specific children who had been identified for purchase. Clara recognized several names, children she had watched grow up, families she had known for years. More children, more families being torn apart, more mothers experiencing the hell that Clara lived with every day. But this time she had advance warning. This time she could do something about it. That evening, Clara called an emergency meeting of the Underground Railroad network. The gathering took place in an abandoned tobacco barn on the outskirts of Millerville, a location that provided perfect cover for clandestine activities. 15 people attended that first meeting: Reverend Thompson, Elizabeth Whitmore, Sarah Mitchell, James Crawford, and 11 enslaved people from various plantations who had proven themselves trustworthy and capable. Clara shared the contents of the Hartwell brothers' letter, watching as the assembled group absorbed the implications of what she had discovered. "They're planning to take 15 to 20 children," she said, her voice steady despite the rage burning inside her. "We have their names, their locations, and their timeline." "What are you proposing?" Reverend Thompson asked. "We stop them. All of them. We don't just save a few children. We destroy their entire operation." The room fell silent as the audacity of Clara's proposal sank in. What she was suggesting went far beyond the network's usual activities of helping individuals escape. She was talking about direct confrontation with one of the most powerful slave trading operations in the South. "That's incredibly dangerous," James Crawford said. "If we're caught, they won't just punish us, they'll make examples of us." "They're already making examples of us," Clara replied. "Every child they sell, every family they destroy, every person they murder, those are examples too. Examples of what happens when we do nothing." Elizabeth Whitmore leaned forward. What exactly do you have in mind? Clara had spent the entire day thinking about this moment, planning not just the immediate operation, but the long-term strategy that would be necessary to sustain their resistance. "We coordinate a mass escape operation," she said. "Not just the children on the Hartwell brothers list, but every family that wants to leave. We hit multiple plantations simultaneously, creating so much chaos that they can't respond effectively." "And then what?" Sarah Mitchell asked. "Even if we get people out, where do they go? The existing safe houses can't handle that many refugees. We create new safe houses. We expand the network. We turn this from a rescue operation into a full-scale exodus." Reverend Thompson shook his head. "Clara, I admire your courage, but what you're describing would require resources we don't have. Money, supplies, transportation, safe houses. The logistics alone would be overwhelming." "Then, we get the resources," Clara said simply. "How?" Clara smiled for the first time in months. "The same way they got their resources, we take them." Clara's plan for economic warfare was both simple and devastating. Instead of trying to compete with the plantation system, they would systematically destroy it from within. The first phase involved coordinated work slowdowns across multiple plantations. Enslaved workers would continue to perform their duties, but at a pace that was just slow enough to reduce productivity without being obviously defiant. "The key is plausible deniability," Clara explained to the network. "If they can't prove we're deliberately slowing down, they can't punish us for it." The second phase involved strategic sabotage of equipment and supplies. Cotton gins would develop mysterious mechanical problems. Tools would break at crucial moments. Livestock would escape from poorly secured enclosures. "Each incident has to look like an accident," Clara emphasized. "But when you have dozens of accidents happening across multiple plantations, the economic impact becomes significant." The third phase was the most ambitious: coordinated escapes timed to coincide with critical agricultural periods. When plantation owners were most dependent on their enslaved workforce, that workforce would simply disappear. "The goal isn't just to help people escape," Clara explained. "It's to make slavery so unprofitable and unreliable that plantation owners start looking for alternatives." As word of Clara's activities spread through the enslaved community, she began receiving information from sources across the region. House slaves from other plantations started passing along overheard conversations. Field workers shared observations about patrol patterns and security measures. Even some free black people in nearby towns began contributing intelligence. The information Clara gathered painted a comprehensive picture of the slavery system's vulnerabilities. She learned which plantation owners were struggling financially, which overseers were corrupt or incompetent, and which routes were safest for escape operations. But most importantly, she discovered that the white community was far more divided than it appeared on the surface. "There are more allies than we realized," Elizabeth Whitmore reported during one of their meetings. "My conversations with other white women have revealed significant sympathy for our cause, even among plantation owners' wives." "How significant?" Clara asked. "Significant enough that several have offered to provide financial support and safe houses." This revelation changed Clara's entire strategy. Instead of viewing the white community as a monolithic enemy, she began to see it as a complex network of competing interests and conflicting loyalties. "We need to exploit those divisions," she told the network. "Turn their own prejudices and fears against them." Clara's psychological warfare campaign expanded beyond simple harassment to sophisticated manipulation of white fears and prejudices. She had spent years studying the psychology of the plantation owners, and now she used that knowledge to devastating effect. Whitmore's paranoia about losing control was fed by a series of carefully orchestrated incidents. Important documents would be moved slightly, suggesting that someone had been reading them. Conversations would be interrupted by mysterious noises, implying that someone was listening. Personal items would disappear and reappear in unexpected locations. "Someone's been in my study," Whitmore complained to his wife after finding his papers rearranged. "Are you sure? Maybe you just forgot how you left them." "I'm not losing my mind, Margaret. Someone is deliberately trying to unnerve me." But Clara's most effective psychological weapon was the systematic revelation of secrets. She had accumulated years of damaging information about the local white community, and now she began to release it strategically. Morrison's embezzlement was exposed through an anonymous letter to Whitmore. A neighboring plantation owner's affair was revealed through carefully placed gossip. Financial improprieties, family scandals, and illegal business dealings were brought to light through a network of sources that the white community couldn't identify or stop. The effect was devastating. The white community, which had always maintained control through unity and mutual support, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and distrust. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Whitmore confided to Dr. Patterson during one of the physician's visits. "Perhaps the problem isn't who to trust," Patterson replied carefully, "but what system you're trying to maintain." As Clara's network expanded, it began to take on characteristics of a military organization. Intelligence gathering became systematic and comprehensive. Operations were planned with military precision. Communication networks were established using coded messages and trusted couriers. Clara found herself functioning as a general, coordinating activities across multiple fronts while maintaining her cover as a submissive house slave. The psychological strain was enormous, but her determination to find her children and protect other families kept her focused. "You're taking incredible risks," Reverend Thompson warned her during one of their meetings. "If they discover what you're really doing—" "They won't," Clara said with quiet confidence, "because they can't imagine that someone like me could be capable of something like this. Someone like you. A black woman, a slave, someone they've trained themselves to see as property rather than a person." Clara had realized that her greatest advantage was the white community's own racism. Their inability to see enslaved people as intelligent, capable, and strategic made them blind to the sophisticated resistance network operating under their noses. "They're so convinced of their own superiority that they can't recognize our intelligence," she explained to the network. "That blindness is our greatest weapon." Clara's first major victory came when she successfully prevented the sale of 8 children from 3 different plantations. Using intelligence gathered from Whitmore's correspondence, she was able to warn families in advance and coordinate their escapes before the sales could take place. The operation required precise timing and flawless execution. Each family had to be moved to safety along different routes to avoid detection. Safe houses had to be prepared in advance. Transportation had to be arranged without arousing suspicion. The most challenging aspect was maintaining operational security. With so many people involved, the risk of betrayal or accidental exposure was enormous. But the operation succeeded beyond Clara's expectations. All 8 children reached safety, along with their families. The plantation owners were left with significant financial losses and no clear explanation for what had happened. "It's like they just vanished," Morrison complained to Whitmore. 8 people don't just disappear without a trace." "Someone's helping them," Whitmore replied grimly. "And when I find out who, there's going to be hell to pay." But Clara had been careful to cover her tracks. The operation had been planned and executed in a way that left no clear evidence of organized resistance. To the plantation owners, it appeared to be a series of unrelated incidents rather than a coordinated campaign. As news of the successful rescue operation spread through the enslaved community, Clara's network began attracting supporters from across the region. Enslaved people who had never considered escape began reaching out for help. Free black people offered resources and assistance. Even some white allies emerged from unexpected quarters. "We're not just rescuing individuals anymore," Clara told the network during one of their meetings. "We're building a movement." The movement's influence extended far beyond escape operations. Clara's intelligence network was providing valuable information to abolitionists in the North, helping them understand the true scope and brutality of the slavery system. Her economic warfare campaign was causing measurable damage to plantation profits across the region. Most importantly, her psychological operations were undermining the white community's confidence in their ability to maintain control. "They're scared," Elizabeth Whitmore reported after attending a social gathering of plantation owners' wives. "They're trying to hide it, but they're genuinely frightened by what's happening." "Good," Clara replied. "Fear makes people make mistakes. and when they make mistakes, we'll be ready to exploit them. Clara's growing success inevitably attracted the attention of those who had the most to lose from her activities. The plantation owners began coordinating their response, sharing information and resources to combat what they were beginning to recognize as an organized resistance movement. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. Thomas, a young enslaved man who had been one of Clara's most trusted allies. Unbeknownst to Clara, Thomas had been captured during a failed escape attempt weeks earlier and had been subjected to brutal interrogation. Morrison had broken Thomas through a combination of physical torture and psychological manipulation, threatening not just Thomas himself, but his elderly mother and younger sister. Faced with the choice between betraying Clara and watching his family suffer, Thomas had chosen betrayal. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Clara during what would be their final conversation. "I'm so sorry." Clara saw the pain in his eyes and understood immediately what had happened. "How much do they know?" "Everything. Names, locations, plans. They know about the network, about the safe houses, about the upcoming operations." Clara felt the world collapsing around her, but her mind was already working on damage control. "How long do we have?" "They're moving tonight." Clara had perhaps 6 hours to warn the network, evacuate the safe houses, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. It wasn't enough time to save everyone, but it might be enough to save some. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I forgive you and I understand." Thomas broke down crying, but Clara had no time for comfort. She had a war to fight. Clara's 6-hour warning gave her just enough time to implement the emergency protocol she had developed for exactly this situation. The network had always known that discovery was inevitable. The key was being prepared when it happened. Her first priority was warning the safe houses. Using a system of coded messages and trusted couriers, she sent word to every location in the network. Some safe houses could be evacuated completely, others would have to be abandoned with their occupants fleeing into the wilderness. Her second priority was protecting the most vulnerable members of the network. Children, elderly people, and those who were sick or injured needed special arrangements. Clara coordinated their movement to the most secure locations while preparing defensive positions at others. Her third priority was destroying evidence. Documents, maps, and correspondence that could implicate network members had to be burned or hidden. The intelligence Clara had gathered over months of careful work was too valuable to lose, but too dangerous to leave where it could be discovered. "We can't save everything," she told Reverend Thompson during a frantic meeting in the abandoned tobacco barn. "But we can save what matters most." What matters most? The people, and the idea that resistance is possible. The plantation owner's response was swift and brutal. At dawn, armed posses surrounded every known safe house simultaneously. They had coordinated with local law enforcement, bringing in additional manpower from neighboring counties. But Clara's warning had given the network just enough time to prepare. When the posses arrived, they found most locations either empty or defended by people who had nothing left to lose. The battle at Sarah Mitchell's boarding house was particularly fierce. Sarah and 6 other network members held off a posse of 20 armed white men for over an hour, giving the refugees hidden in the basement time to escape through a tunnel that connected to the nearby creek. Sarah herself was captured, but not before ensuring that 17 people reached safety. The confrontation at James Crawford's farm was even more dramatic. Crawford, a white man who had risked everything to support the network, stood on his front porch with a shotgun and refused to allow the posse to search his property. "This is my land," he told the assembled men, "and you have no legal authority to search it without a warrant." "We don't need a warrant to hunt down runaway slaves," the posse leader replied. "You do need one to search a white man's property," Crawford shot back. "And if you try to enter my house without proper legal authority, I'll defend it." The standoff lasted for hours, giving the refugees hidden in Crawford's barn time to escape through the woods. Crawford was eventually arrested, but his defiance had saved lives. The final confrontation took place at Whitmore Plantation itself. Clara had known from the beginning that her activities would eventually be traced back to her, and she had prepared for this moment. When the armed posse arrived at the plantation, They found Clara exactly where they expected her to be, in the slave quarters, surrounded by the people she had spent months organizing and inspiring. But what they didn't expect was the scene that greeted them. Clara stood in the center of a circle formed by 30 enslaved people from Whitmore Plantation and several neighboring properties. They had come together not to fight. They had no weapons and no illusions about their ability to resist armed white men, but to bear witness. "Clara Washington," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the plantation yard. "You're under arrest for inciting rebellion, destroying property, and conspiracy to commit theft." Clara stepped forward, her head held high. "My name is Clara Washington," she said in a voice that carried to every person present. "I am a mother, I am a human being, and I am not your property." The words echoed across the plantation like a declaration of war. "You have caused enough trouble," Whitmore said, his face flushed with rage. "Your little rebellion is over." "My rebellion?" Clara smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mr. Whitmore, my rebellion is just beginning." What happened next shocked everyone present, including Clara herself. As the armed men moved to arrest her, a voice called out from the crowd of white men, "Wait." Dr. Patterson stepped forward, his medical bag in his hand and a determined expression on his face. "This woman is under my medical care," he announced. "She's pregnant, and any rough treatment could endanger both her life and the life of her unborn child." Clara stared at Patterson in shock. She wasn't pregnant. They both knew that. But Patterson's declaration created a legal complication that the posse wasn't prepared to handle. "That's ridiculous," Morrison sputtered. "She's not—" "Are you questioning my medical judgment?" Patterson interrupted. "Because if you are, I'd be happy to explain to a judge why you ignored a physician's professional assessment." The posse leader looked uncertain. Harming a pregnant woman, even an enslaved one, carried legal and social consequences that could complicate their mission. But Clara realized that Patterson's intervention was about more than just buying time. He was making a statement about her humanity, her worth as a person rather than property. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly, "but I don't need protection." She turned to face the assembled crowd, enslaved and free, black and white, supporters and enemies. "I want everyone here to understand something," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "What we've done here isn't about rebellion. It's about recognition. Recognition that we are human beings with the same rights, the same feelings, the same capacity for love and loss as anyone else." She gestured toward the plantation house where Whitmore stood with his wife and children. "Mr. Whitmore, you sold my children because you needed money. You tore apart my family because it was convenient for you. You treated my babies like livestock because that's how you've been taught to see us." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But we are not livestock. We are not property. We are people. And people have the right to protect their families, to resist injustice, and to fight for their freedom." As Clara spoke, something unprecedented began to happen. Several white members of the posse began to look uncomfortable. Some lowered their weapons. A few actually stepped back. Dr. Patterson wasn't the only white person present who had been affected by Clara's campaign. Months of psychological warfare, combined with the revelation of secrets and the economic pressure of the resistance movement, had created cracks in the white community's solidarity. "She's right," a voice called out from the crowd. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Margaret Whitmore, the plantation owner's wife. "Margaret!" Whitmore exclaimed in shock. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying she's right, Edmund. We've been treating these people like animals, and it's wrong. It's morally wrong. And it's destroying our souls." Margaret stepped forward to stand beside Clara, an action that sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. "I've watched this woman work in our house for years," Margaret continued. "I've seen her intelligence, her dignity, her love for her children. And I've done nothing to help her because I was afraid of what people would think." She turned to face her husband directly. "But I'm not afraid anymore. What we're doing here is evil, and I won't be part of it any longer." Margaret's declaration triggered a cascade of similar statements from other white observers. Not all of them, perhaps not even most, but enough to create visible division in what had previously appeared to be a united front. As the confrontation continued, James Crawford arrived with a group of white businessmen from town. Crawford had been released on bail, and he had spent his freedom gathering support from an unexpected quarter, the merchant class. "Gentlemen," Crawford addressed the posse, "before you proceed with this arrest, you might want to consider the economic implications of your actions." "What economic implications?" the posse leader asked. "The resistance movement that this woman has organized has cost local plantation owners thousands of dollars in lost productivity, damaged equipment, and escaped workers. But it's also demonstrated something important. Enslaved labor is inherently unreliable and economically inefficient." Crawford gestured toward Clara and the assembled enslaved people. "These people have shown that they're capable of sophisticated organization, strategic thinking, and coordinated action. Those are valuable skills in any economic system. The question is whether we want to continue trying to exploit those skills through force, or whether we want to find ways to benefit from them through cooperation." It was an argument that appealed to the white community's self-interest rather than their moral sensibilities, but it was effective precisely because of that focus. "What are you suggesting?" Whitmore asked. "I'm suggesting that the slavery system is doomed," Crawford replied bluntly, "not because of moral arguments or political pressure, but because it's economically unsustainable. This resistance movement has proven that enslaved people can organize effectively against their oppressors. That makes slavery too risky and too expensive to maintain." What followed was unprecedented in the history of the antebellum South, a negotiation between enslaved people and their masters, mediated by white allies and conducted in full view of the entire community. Clara found herself speaking not just for herself, but for every enslaved person on the plantation and beyond. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "What do you want?" Whitmore asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "Freedom," Clara replied simply. "For everyone. Not just the people here, but everyone who's been held in bondage." "That's impossible. The economic disruption alone—" "The economic disruption is already happening," Clara interrupted. "We've proven that we can make slavery unprofitable whenever we choose to. The question is whether you want to work with us to find a better system, or whether you want to continue fighting a war you can't win." The negotiation continued for hours, with various proposals and counter-proposals being discussed. Some plantation owners were willing to consider gradual emancipation with compensation. Others insisted that any change would have to come through legal channels rather than direct action. But the most important outcome of the negotiation wasn't any specific agreement. It was the recognition that enslaved people were capable of representing their own interests and negotiating as equals. Clara was never arrested that day. The legal complications created by Dr. Patterson's intervention, combined with the political pressure generated by the white allies who had emerged during the confrontation, made prosecution impossible. But more importantly, the entire dynamic of the plantation had been permanently altered. Clara was no longer a slave in any meaningful sense. She was a leader, a negotiator, a force that the white community had to acknowledge and respect. The transformation wasn't limited to Clara herself. The other enslaved people on the plantation had witnessed her confrontation with the masters and had seen that resistance was not only possible, but effective. Within weeks, the plantation's productivity had declined so dramatically that Whitmore was forced to negotiate directly with his enslaved workforce about working conditions, compensation, and treatment. "This isn't how things are supposed to work," he complained to his wife. "Maybe that's the problem," Margaret replied. "Maybe the way things are supposed to work is wrong." With her immediate safety secured and her position on the plantation fundamentally changed, Clara was finally able to focus on her original goal, finding her children. The intelligence network she had built proved invaluable in this effort. Through contacts in Charleston, she learned that Samuel had been moved from the rice plantation to a cotton farm in Alabama after proving difficult to manage. Mary was still in Savannah, but her situation had deteriorated significantly. "The family that bought her is planning to sell her," Elizabeth Whitmore reported after receiving information from her Charleston contacts. "They claim she's too intelligent and too defiant to be properly trained." Clara felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Her daughter was showing the same spirit that had driven Clara's own resistance, but that spirit was putting Mary in danger. "We need to get her out," Clara said. "Both of them." "That will require a major operation," Reverend Thompson warned. "Alabama and Georgia are hundreds of miles apart, and both children are being held in heavily guarded locations. Then we plan a major operation." The rescue of Clara's children required everything the network had learned over months of resistance activities. Intelligence gathering, strategic planning, coordinated timing, and flawless execution were all essential to success. The operation began with Clara herself traveling to Savannah under the cover of accompanying Margaret Whitmore on a shopping trip. Margaret had become one of Clara's strongest allies, and she used her social connections to gather information about Mary's location and situation. Meanwhile, other network members traveled to Alabama to locate Samuel and assess the security around the cotton farm where he was being held. The actual rescues were planned to occur simultaneously, preventing either location from being alerted about the other operation. Clara would personally extract Mary from Savannah, while a team led by James Crawford would retrieve Samuel from Alabama. The Savannah operation was complicated by the urban environment and the need to avoid detection by local law enforcement. Clara had to infiltrate the household where Mary was being held, locate her daughter, and extract her without raising an alarm. The Alabama operation was even more challenging. Samuel was being held on a remote plantation with limited access routes and heavy security. The rescue team would have to overcome physical barriers as well as armed resistance. Both operations succeeded, but not without cost. Clara was nearly captured during her escape from Savannah, and the Alabama team had to fight their way out after being discovered by plantation guards. But when Clara was finally reunited with her children after more than a year of separation, the cost seemed insignificant compared to the joy of holding them again. "Mama," Samuel whispered as she embraced him, "I knew you'd come for us." "I promised I would," Clara replied, tears streaming down her face, "and I always keep my promises." The successful rescue of Clara's children marked the end of one phase of her resistance movement and the beginning of another. With her family reunited, Clara faced a choice. She could disappear into the Underground Railroad network and seek safety in the north, or she could remain in Georgia and continue the fight for broader change. She chose to stay. "Why?" Reverend Thompson asked during one of their meetings. "You've accomplished what you set out to do. Your children are safe. You could start a new life in freedom." "Because this was never just about my children," Clara replied. "It was about all children, all families, all people who deserve to be free." Clara's decision to remain in Georgia and continue her resistance activities sent shockwaves through both the enslaved and white communities. Her successful confrontation with the plantation owners had proven that change was possible, but her continued presence ensured that the pressure for change would not diminish. Word of Clara's success spread rapidly through the Underground Railroad network and beyond. Enslaved people across the South began organizing their own resistance movements, using Clara's methods and strategies as a blueprint for action. The psychological warfare techniques she had developed were particularly effective because they could be adapted to local conditions and implemented without requiring extensive resources or coordination. Individual enslaved people could begin undermining their master's confidence and authority simply by following Clara's example. The economic warfare strategies were also widely adopted. Coordinated work slowdowns, strategic sabotage, and mass escapes began occurring across multiple states, creating a pattern of resistance that plantation owners found increasingly difficult to combat. But perhaps most importantly, Clara's example had demonstrated that enslaved people could organize sophisticated resistance movements and negotiate with their oppressors as equals. This recognition fundamentally altered the relationship between enslaved and free people throughout the region. The white community's response to Clara's movement was complex and divided. Some plantation owners attempted to suppress resistance through increased brutality and surveillance. Others began exploring alternatives to enslaved labor, recognizing that the system was becoming too unstable and expensive to maintain. A significant minority of white people, inspired by the moral arguments made by Clara and her allies, began actively supporting abolition. This group included not just traditional abolitionists, but also business leaders, religious figures, and even some plantation owners who had concluded that slavery was economically and morally unsustainable. "The old system is dying," Dr. Patterson observed during one of his conversations with Clara. "The question is, what will replace it?" "Something better," Clara replied with quiet confidence. "Something based on human dignity rather than human exploitation." Clara's resistance movement had political implications that extended far beyond the local community. The success of her strategies demonstrated that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated political organization and strategic thinking, challenging fundamental assumptions about race and intelligence that underpinned the slavery system. Northern abolitionists began citing Clara's movement as evidence that enslaved people were ready for freedom and capable of participating fully in American society. Southern politicians, meanwhile, pointed to the same movement as proof that slavery was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain and that alternative labor systems needed to be developed. The political pressure generated by Clara's movement and similar resistance activities across the South contributed to the growing national debate about slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Clara's success came at enormous personal cost. The years of stress, danger, and constant vigilance had taken a physical and emotional toll that would affect her for the rest of her life. The trauma of losing her children, even temporarily, had left psychological scars that never fully healed. But Clara had also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that she had made a difference. Her resistance movement had saved lives, reunited families, and demonstrated that change was possible even in the most oppressive circumstances. Was it worth it? Margaret Whitmore asked Clara during one of their conversations. Clara looked at her children, playing safely in the yard of the small farm where they now lived as free people, and smiled. "Every moment of it," she replied. Clara's story didn't end with the rescue of her children or the success of her resistance movement. She continued to work with the Underground Railroad network, helping other families escape bondage and organizing resistance activities across the South. When the Civil War began in 1861, Clara was among the first to volunteer her services to the Union cause. Her intelligence-gathering skills, her knowledge of Southern geography and society, and her experience in organizing resistance movements made her invaluable to Union military commanders. She served as a scout, a spy, and an organizer of contraband camps where escaped enslaved people could find safety and support. Her work during the war saved countless lives and contributed significantly to the Union victory. Samuel and Mary, now teenagers, joined their mother in her war efforts. Samuel became a messenger for Union forces, using his intelligence and courage to carry vital information across enemy lines. Mary worked in the contraband camps, teaching literacy to newly freed people and helping them navigate their transition to freedom. "We're finishing what you started, Mama," Samuel told Clara as they worked together to establish a school for freed children in occupied Georgia. "No, baby," Clara replied, watching as dozens of children who had been born into slavery learned to read and write. "We're just beginning." After the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, Clara faced new challenges and opportunities. The Reconstruction era brought the promise of true equality, but it also brought violent resistance from white supremacists who were determined to maintain racial hierarchy through other means. Clara's experience in organizing resistance movements proved invaluable during this period. She helped establish schools, churches, and political organizations that would serve the newly freed black community. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to ensure that former enslaved people received the support and resources they needed to build independent lives. But Clara also recognized that the fight for true equality would require sustained effort over many years. The same psychological and economic strategies she had used against the slavery system would be necessary to combat the new forms of oppression that emerged during Reconstruction. "They've changed the laws," she told a gathering of community leaders in 1867, "but they haven't changed their hearts. We still have work to do." One of Clara's most important contributions during Reconstruction was her work in education. She understood that literacy and knowledge were essential tools for maintaining freedom and achieving true equality. Working with Northern missionaries and local black leaders, Clara helped establish dozens of schools across Georgia. These institutions provided not just basic education, but also training in practical skills that would help freed people become economically independent. Education is the foundation of freedom, Clara often told her students. They kept us ignorant to keep us enslaved. Now we must educate ourselves to stay free. Mary followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming a teacher and eventually establishing her own school for black children in Atlanta. Samuel became a lawyer, using his education to fight legal battles for civil rights and economic justice. Clara's understanding of economic warfare proved crucial during Reconstruction, as freed people struggled to establish economic independence. She helped organize cooperative businesses, credit unions, and mutual aid societies that provided alternatives to the exploitative sharecropping system that many white landowners tried to impose. Economic independence is just as important as political freedom, Clara explained to a group of farmers who were considering forming a cooperative. If we depend on them for our livelihood, we're still not truly free. The economic institutions Clara helped establish became models for black economic development throughout the South. Her emphasis on collective action and mutual support created sustainable alternatives to the exploitative systems that had replaced slavery. As black men gained the right to vote during Reconstruction, Clara became involved in political organizing. Although she couldn't vote herself due to gender restrictions, she played a crucial role in educating voters and organizing political campaigns. Clara's experience in psychological warfare proved particularly valuable in political contexts. She understood how to identify and exploit divisions within the white community, how to build coalitions across racial lines, and how to use information strategically to achieve political goals. Politics is just another form of warfare, she told a group of black political leaders. The same strategies that worked against the plantation owners will work against the politicians who want to keep us down. Clara's continued activism made her a target for white supremacist violence during the later years of Reconstruction. The Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations recognized her as a significant threat to their efforts to restore white supremacy. Several attempts were made on Clara's life, and her home was attacked multiple times. But Clara's experience in underground resistance had prepared her for this kind of danger. She organized security networks, established safe houses, and developed communication systems that allowed black communities to protect themselves against terrorist attacks. "They want us to be afraid," Clara told a gathering of community leaders after a particularly violent attack. "But fear is what kept us enslaved. We can't let fear keep us from being free." By the 1870s, Clara's story had become known throughout the country. Northern newspapers wrote articles about her resistance movement and her work during Reconstruction. Abolitionists and civil rights activists cited her example as proof of black people's capacity for leadership and self-determination. Clara was invited to speak at conferences and rallies across the North, sharing her experiences and advocating for continued federal protection of black rights. Her speeches were powerful and moving, combining personal narrative with political analysis in ways that inspired audiences and influenced policy debates. "I'm not an exceptional person," Clara would tell these audiences. "I am simply a mother who refused to accept that my children should be treated as property. Every black person in this country has that same capacity for resistance, that same demand for dignity, that same right to freedom." As Clara aged, she increasingly focused on mentoring younger activists and leaders. She understood that the struggle for equality would continue long after her own death, and she wanted to ensure that future generations would have the knowledge and skills necessary to continue the fight. Clara's mentorship style was demanding, but supportive. She expected excellence from her protégés, but provided them with the tools and knowledge they needed to achieve it. Many of the civil rights leaders who emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries traced their inspiration and training back to Clara Washington. "The movement is bigger than any individual," Clara would tell her students. "Our job is not to finish the fight ourselves, but to prepare the next generation to carry it forward." Clara's children and grandchildren continued her legacy of activism and service. Samuel became one of the most prominent black lawyers in the South, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, and helping to establish legal precedents that would later be used in the modern civil rights movement. Mary's educational work expanded to include teacher training and curriculum development. She helped establish normal schools that trained black teachers throughout the South, ensuring that future generations would have access to quality education. Clara's grandchildren became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business leaders, but they all carried forward her commitment to social justice and community service. The Washington family became synonymous with black excellence and resistance to oppression. Clara's resistance movement had impacts that extended far beyond her own lifetime. The strategies and tactics she developed were studied and adapted by civil rights activists throughout the 20th century. Her emphasis on economic pressure, psychological warfare, and coalition building became standard elements of successful social movements. The Underground Railroad network that Clara had helped expand and strengthen continued to operate in different forms long after slavery ended. During the Jim Crow era, similar networks helped black people escape lynching and other forms of racial violence. During the civil rights movement, these same organizational structures were used to coordinate protests and protect activists. Clara's example also influenced international liberation movements. Her story was translated into multiple languages and studied by anti-colonial activists in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, who were fighting their own battles against oppression and exploitation. Perhaps Clara's most important contribution was philosophical rather than tactical. She had demonstrated that oppressed people could maintain their humanity and dignity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. Her refusal to accept the definitions that oppressors tried to impose on her became a model for resistance movements around the world. "They tried to make us believe we were less than human," Clara reflected in one of her final speeches. "But we knew better. We knew that our capacity for love, for sacrifice, for courage, for intelligence was just as great as anyone else's. That knowledge was our greatest weapon." Clara's philosophical approach emphasized the importance of maintaining hope and humanity even in the darkest circumstances. She believed that oppressed people had to resist not just the external structures of oppression, but also the internal psychological damage that oppression could cause. Clara lived to see the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the Jim Crow era. The rollback of civil rights gains during the 1880s and 1890s was heartbreaking for someone who had fought so hard for freedom and equality. But Clara never lost her optimism or her commitment to the struggle. Even as segregation laws were enacted and voting rights were stripped away, she continued to organize, to teach, and to inspire others to keep fighting. "This is not the end," she told a gathering of young activists in 1895. "This is just another chapter in a long story. The arc of history bends toward justice, but only if we keep pulling it in that direction." Clara Washington died in 1901 at the age of 74, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and the many people whose lives she had touched. Her funeral was attended by thousands of people, both black and white, who had been influenced by her example and her work. Clara's death marked the end of an era, but not the end of the movement she had helped create. Her students and protégés continued her work, adapting her strategies to new circumstances and new challenges. During the early 20th century, Clara's emphasis on economic organizing influenced the development of black business districts and cooperative enterprises. Her psychological warfare techniques were used by civil rights activists to challenge segregation and discrimination. Her coalition-building strategies helped create the interracial alliances that would be crucial to the success of the modern civil rights movement. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus in 1955, she was following in the footsteps of Clara Washington. When Martin Luther King Jr. organized the Montgomery bus boycott, he was using economic pressure tactics that Clara had pioneered. When the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee organized voter registration drives in the 1960s, they were building on organizational structures that traced back to Clara's Underground Railroad network. Today, Clara Washington's story continues to inspire activists and organizers around the world. Her example demonstrates that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice and are willing to fight for change. Clara's strategies and tactics are still relevant in contemporary social movements. Her emphasis on economic pressure can be seen in modern boycott campaigns. Her psychological warfare techniques are reflected in contemporary efforts to challenge dominant narratives and change public opinion. Her coalition-building approach is evident in successful movements that bring together diverse groups around common goals. But perhaps most importantly, Clara's story reminds us that social change is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. Her transformation from a seemingly powerless enslaved woman to a leader who could negotiate with plantation owners as an equal demonstrates the potential for human agency and resistance even under the most oppressive conditions. 150 years later, in a small museum in rural Georgia, not far from where Whitmore Plantation once stood, visitors can see exhibits about Clara Washington and the resistance movement she led. The museum is housed in a building that was once a school for freed slaves, established by Clara herself during Reconstruction. Among the artifacts on display is a letter that Clara wrote to her great-granddaughter in 1900, shortly before her death. "My dear child, I am writing this letter so that you will always remember where you came from and what your family has fought for. We were not always free, but we were always human. We were not always powerful, but we always had the power to resist. The struggle for justice is not something that ends with a single victory or a single generation. It is something that each generation must take up anew, adapting to new circumstances, but never forgetting the fundamental truth that all people deserve dignity, respect, and freedom. You will face challenges that I cannot imagine, just as I faced challenges that my mother could not have imagined. But you will also have tools and opportunities that previous generations could only dream of. Use them wisely, use them courageously. Use them in service of something greater than yourself. Remember that the revolution I started was not about me. It was about the idea that change is possible, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that love is stronger than hate, hope is stronger than fear, and justice is stronger than oppression. That revolution continues in you. Make me proud. With all my love, your great-grandmother Clara." The letter is displayed next to a photograph of Clara taken in her later years. She is surrounded by her children and grandchildren, all of them free, all of them educated, all of them carrying forward her legacy of resistance and hope. But the most powerful exhibit in the museum is not an artifact at all. It is a simple plaque that bears Clara's most famous words, spoken during her confrontation with the plantation owners in 1855. "They can break our backs, but they can't break our spirits, not unless we let them." Those words continue to echo through history, inspiring new generations of activists and organizers who understand that the fight for justice is never finished, that each generation must find its own ways to resist oppression and build a more equitable world. Clara Washington's revolution began with a mother's love for her children. It grew into a movement that helped end slavery and establish the foundations for civil rights. And it continues today in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who stands up for the oppressed, and who believes that a better world is possible. The slave masters thought they could break Clara's spirit by taking her children. Instead, they unleashed a force that would help break the chains of an entire nation. Her retaliation didn't just make the slave masters tremble, it made the whole world shake. And that shaking continues still. If this incredible epic story of courage, resistance, and the unbreakable power of a mother's love moved you to tears and inspired your soul, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this video to honor Clara's memory and the countless heroes who fought for freedom throughout history. What other untold stories of resistance and heroism would you like to hear? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Your next favorite story might be just one comment away. If you believe that Clara Washington's legacy deserves to be remembered and celebrated, give this video a massive thumbs up, and let's make sure her story reaches millions of people around the world. This epic tale, while dramatized for narrative purposes, represents the very real experiences of countless enslaved mothers, fathers, and children who suffered under the brutal system of American slavery. Their courage, their resistance, their sacrifices, and their ultimate triumph over oppression deserve to be remembered, honored, and celebrated for all time. Clara Washington's story is their story, and their revolution continues in all of us who refuse to accept injustice and who fight for a better world.